ICC is now seeking arrest warrants for the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and his Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. And yet you still have Biden, who's in the White House, who's a Democrat, giving undying support. The Republicans even worse. Here you have Rishi Sunak giving undying support, and Keir Starmer maybe even worse as well. So people are like, well, do I live in a democracy? I can't vote for a party that's against this genocide or against this massacre. People are quite shocked because it's never been clearer that there is a real lack of democracy. I think the whole mask has been pulled off the system. I don't think it will stop with Gaza. I think that once people realise that they're being lied to, or at least they don't have a choice on something as big as Gaza, they start looking at other things and think, well, maybe both the parties are an expression of the same system.
Matt Kennard, welcome back to PoliticsJOE.
Thanks for having me again, man.
It's a pleasure. How you been?
I've been all right, yeah. I've been following the election stuff, which has been interesting. Well, the independents anyway. Haven't really followed much of the Starmer-Sunak stuff.
Mainstream parties.
Yeah.
We're here to talk because the Racket, your latest work. Tell us about it.
It's a big book, and it's an ambitious book. And basically what it tries to do is explain the mechanics of the American empire. And most of the reporting from it is from all around the world. It's from Haiti to Honduras to South Africa to Egypt. And most of the reporting was done while I was at the Financial Times a while back. And really, while I was there, I was kind of understanding that we have this major force in the world, the most powerful empire in the history of the world. Everyone says that. Experts, journalists, anyone who's studied empires over history knows that the US way surpasses anything that's come before. And it's not in the game to spread freedom and democracy, which is what they tell themselves and they tell the world. It's there to do what every empire has done in history, which is to take resources and exert control over the rest of the world. But at the Financial Times and the rest of the mainstream media, you can't talk about the US empire. I mean, you can't even talk about the reality of the US empire. You can't even use that term, really. You'll be able to use terms like Russian imperialism and Chinese imperialism, and of course, they're superpowers that are interested in the same things. But when it comes to the US empire and its adjunct, the UK, you can't talk about it in those terms. So I gathered lots and lots of information from the horse's mouth that kind of explained how this system works, this US imperial system. And at the Financial Times, obviously, when you go places, you have access to everyone. So I'd go to Haiti. They sent me to Haiti the year after the earthquake, and I could go and speak to the ambassador, had top echelons of the World Bank. I was actually working for the FT in Washington as well. I'd go into the Obama White House if I wanted to call up one of his administration people, that I could do that easily. But obviously, it wasn't really in tune with my politics, the Financial Times, so I knew quite early on that I would leave. So I kind of thought, well, I should collect as much information as I can because I'm never going to get this opportunity again. And I think that was a good prediction. I've definitely burnt all my bridges with the mainstream media. I'm not going to be sent back to Washington by any newspaper in the UK, I don't think. But yeah, the book, so the mechanics are quite simple, really. The US empire is different to other empires in the sense that it doesn't operate formal colonies, although it does have some, but it's not like the British Empire in that sense. But what it is an informal empire, or what's called an open door empire. So what that means is that, and this was erected pretty much after the Second World War, but earlier as well. But it says if a country is open to our corporate interests and investment from the US, and and basically does what we say in a sort of international setting diplomatically, that's fine. We're fine with it. We don't need you to be a formal colony. But if you elect a leader, or a leader comes to power that threatens those corporate interests, we'll take you out, or we'll launch a massive program of subterfuge to try and get you out through intelligence agencies or whatever it is. I mean, we all know the famous cases like Salvador Allende in Chile in 1973, Venezuela in 2002, which the Bush administration admitted they were part of the coup there that was eventually overturned. So it's a really global picture of how the system operates. And it's also an analysis of the mainstream media, because as I said at the start, it is insane, really, that you can have the most powerful empire in the history of the world that is I think the governing dynamic of international affairs, it's impossible to really understand international affairs unless you understand the power of the United States within it. And yet it's unmentionable in the mainstream media, so it's an invisible empire.
It's kind of euphemistic, isn't it? Like, you'll hear phrases like unipolar moment or American hegemony.
Yeah.
But the lexicon is different, like you said, because you will talk about, Russian imperialism or Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, or a relation of great power struggle between China and America. But it is. It's kind of inferred or implied when you're talking about America, whereas media is more inclined to sort of call it what it is when they're talking about other nations.
Yeah.
Just to talk about the media aspect of it for a second, I guess. Formerly FT, co-founder of Declassified, which is very explicit and sort of, does seek to shine a light on Western foreign policy, Western military policy. There's clearly a divergence from sort of the FT's line of reporting on this. Yeah. So you're actually in quite a privileged position to talk about when your journalism does start to look at the things that the state and the establishment doesn't want people to look at, how you get treated versus when you're at, an established legacy brand like the FT.
Yeah, well, it's completely different. Firstly, you lose the access completely. So one of the amazing things about being at the FT or the BBC or wherever it is that it's kind of easy, because if you want a story, you call up someone who's in a position to make a policy, and they'll tell you something, and that's a story by itself. So it's kind of that client journalism is very easy to do. When you withdraw yourself from that, you're marginalised. So you don't have access to institutions that will be able to get your journalism out. But secondly, you lose that access, so you have to find the information other ways. But one of the major things I found at Declassified is that there is a lot of information out there that's just not picked up. I believe that the way that the propaganda system works here and in the United States, and probably in Europe, I haven't looked at it as closely, but is propaganda by omission. So, and the FT is a very good newspaper. It's the best of the bunch, in my opinion.
I'd say so as well.
And I saw that from the inside. They're very, very, they tell you early on you have to get everything right. It's a very fact-based newspaper. But the way that propaganda works for them is they're not lying to you, but they leave out all the information that you need to have a realistic understanding of the issues they're talking about. So, and at Declassified, we actually wanted to model our journalism on FT journalism. We wanted to make it everything fact-checked and referenced and not really have any verbiage in that sense. And then you find that there's information everywhere that people just aren't picking up. I'll give you one example, which was actually quite a crazy example. I think it was last year. Some lord, I can't remember if it was a Tory lord or a Labour lord or a crossbencher, but some lord asked the question of the Ministry of Defence about the Challenger 2 tanks that we'd sent to Ukraine. They said, are you also sending depleted uranium shells, which is what they use on those tanks? And this was in a parliamentary answer. They said, yes, we are. So, and then it kind of stayed on the Parliament website. My colleague Phil Miller, who's a great reporter, saw it, published a story. By the afternoon, Putin was talking about it in a press conference. By the following day, he'd said he was going to deploy tactical nukes to Belarus based on the fact that Britain was sending depleted uranium shells to Ukraine. Now, you can say Putin's reasons for doing it were probably much more complicated than just the article. But if Phil hadn't taken that story, which was just out there, that would have never entered the information system at all. So there's all this information out there that is just not covered by journalists. And in the case of the US empire, I mean, I saw it in the FT in very explicit ways as well. Like that, it also works by just a way of talking about international affairs, which is conducive to the state narrative. And again, I can be specific about that in the sense of, like, I would write an article about Hezbollah, and you'd write Iranian-backed militant group Hezbollah. But yet you would never write US-backed Wahhabi dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, which is true. They're both true, right? Why? And those kind of ticks that journalists aren't even aware that they're expressing or enforcing are everywhere. And it gives this, and it's all in the interests of the power centers, basically, mainly the state in that kind of case, but also corporate interests as well. So it's very, very important to kind of clear away all that pollution that is pumped into our information system and makes it really hard to understand what is going on. And as I say, the FT is the best of the bunch, but it's still deeply embedded in the propaganda system. It's just better than the others.
I wouldn't have expected us to be getting so deep on sort of linguistic analysis in the first 5 minutes, but there you go. Okay, so you're clearly, you're an expert in international affairs, foreign policy, and I think one of the quite striking differences between British electoral politics and American electoral politics is that when you get to a presidential election in the States, foreign policy is a massive part of the discourse. Journalists will regularly ask the candidates, what's your position on Ukraine, what's your position on Israel? Yeah. And admittedly, that's because the president has, I would say, a much greater degree of sort of agency and authority when it comes to foreign policy than our prime minister does. Yeah. But there's a really significant always significant conflict happening right now, in relation to Gaza and the massacre that's happening there. And I wonder if that, in your view, will change the sort of role of foreign policy in the general election that's happening in the UK right now. And if you could focus your answer particularly in relation to Gaza, be useful.
I mean, well, firstly, it relates to the book in Gaza in the sense that Israel could not operate without the United States. It's effectively a colony of the United States. Like Israel's population is 9 million people. It's the same population as London, where we're sitting. Its GDP is smaller than Sweden. It gets $4 billion in military aid every year from the United States and all sorts of other. There's all sorts of other elements to that support as well. So it couldn't exist. But then what you see is that both parties, the mainstream parties in both the US and the UK, are just vying to outdo each other in giving undying support to Israel while it commits awful crimes, some of the worst crimes of the modern era. And I think, personally, that it's been a massive wake-up call to a lot of people because obviously Israel's been investigated by the World Court for genocide. It's the ICC is now seeking arrest warrants for the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and yet you still have Biden, who's in the White House, who's a Democrat, giving undying support. You have the Republicans even worse. Here you have Rishi Sunak giving undying support, and Keir Starmer maybe even worse as well. So people are like, well, do I live in a democracy? I can't vote for a party that's against this genocide or against this massacre. And I think that is a real, from my conversations with people that aren't into politics, people are quite shocked because it's never been clearer that there is a real lack of democracy. And I think, to go to your question about foreign policy, in my experience here, and I think it's the same in the United States, the two mainstream parties are quite similar on domestic policy, but there are sort of small variations. On foreign policy, they're in nearly complete lockstep because the political system is operating above a system where policy is really made on foreign policy, because it's an imperial system which is being designed in the State Department or in the Foreign Office or in the Ministry of Defence. I think that it's never, ever been as exposed as this, because the other thing is that this colony, effectively, Israel, they're talking in ways that the West don't talk. Like, even in the war in Iraq, which was a major crime, an illegal war, as called by Kofi Annan when he was head of the UN, Bush and Blair niced it up. They said they weren't going out saying we're dealing with human animals, or they weren't saying we're going to starve you to death. Whereas the Israelis are just promoting the fact that there's a genocidal intent in their government. So I think that, and still in that without the PR, that our governments are still in lockstep. And in fact, just the other day, the House of Representatives vote to sanction the ICC officials that had issued arrest warrants. So I think the whole mask has been pulled off the system. And I don't think it will stop with Gaza. I think that once people realise that they're being lied to, or at least they don't have a choice on something as big as Gaza, they start looking at other things and think, well, maybe both the parties are an expression of the same system. And I think one of my beliefs is that the two-party system is one of the biggest promoters of oligarchy. Oligarchy being the rule of a small elite, because if you've only got two parties that can effectively form a government, and you capture both of them, then you've got the appearance of democracy because people go out and they can vote for either side. But if both parties are working for the same oligarchy, then it's beautiful. It's a beautiful system. And in fact, if you look in Latin America, and there's a lot of this stuff in the book actually about, because the real resistance to the American empire in recent years has been in Latin America, independent governments that have come up. So if you look at like Venezuela under Chavez or Bolivia under Evo Morales, Ecuador under Rafael Correa, all of those leaders had to create new parties to get into power because the existing parties kind of are around to stop people like that getting into power. And actually a very interesting case is Mexico, where I lived actually. And there's a whole chapter on the Zapatistas in the book. But I lived in Mexico and I was there when Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, AMLO, the Mexican president, lost the election in 2013, I think it was, or 12. And it was stolen from him. And he created a new party a couple of years later called Moreno. And then 4 years after, he was in power as president, and he's left with 80% approval ratings. His successor has just won with a massive landslide. And that was with a new party that was created literally 10 years ago. So I think that there's lessons for the left there. There's lessons for all of us to understand what the two-party system does. And I think that my belief is that this is a real turning point in world history. I know that sounds very, maybe a bit overwrought, but I really think the length of it, 8 months of it, 8 months of, and it's been live streamed on our phones and everyone's outraged.
I think that's a key moment, actually. It's the sort of, I'm not going to sit here and wax lyrical about like the great democratization of social media, because there's clearly very serious issues about sort of the concentration of power over our information systems, the mega corporations with GDPs bigger than a lot of countries that control those systems. Nonetheless, though, there is to a certain extent a kind of proliferation and democratization of information, which leads to this really powerful and peculiar political effect of disassociation, right? You see the horror. And you pick your conflict. It's not just Gaza, it could be Ukraine, it could be Congo, it could be anywhere. And you can quite easily and quickly see the horror. You can, and I don't need to be explicit about it, we've all seen it, right? And so on the one hand, you're there and you just had your dinner, you sat at home, you watch the video and you're like, Jesus fucking Christ, how are we allowing this to happen? This is appalling on a moral level, on a personal level, on a human level. I'm disgusted by this. You switch on the 7 o'clock news, 6 o'clock news, and it's like, we'll support Israel until we win.
Yes.
And I think a regular person sits there going, what on earth are you talking about? What do you mean? Totally. Why are we not talking? And I think that's why a huge amount of the anger about immediate ceasefire and the sort of relatively, I don't want to say inane, but political discourse within the Labour Party about, well, we're going to have a staggered and limited and then we'll eventually get there or whatever it is. And people are going, no. No, you stop this now. And that has the potential to be a really powerful political force. I don't know if it will be.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that also alternative media, because it's exposed that the media doesn't do its job. Like at Declassified, we're the only outlet really that's revealed the UK military role in Gaza, which is extensive, you know.
You talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Well, we've been on it now for 7 or 8 months from the start. So the UK has been massively involved in the military operation, and there's a lot of information we don't know. So just to give you some examples, the story I published recently, like a couple of weeks ago, was about how the UK has flown 200 spy flights over Gaza since December, nearly one a day. And they announced it in December, but they refused to say how many they were flying. So you would think it was to do with, they said it was only to do with hostage rescue. So you think it may be a couple of flights a month or something, or because the Israelis control the Gaza Strip, what more information? But they're doing nearly one a day, 6-hour flights over Gaza, collecting all sorts of intelligence. They won't tell us what they're doing with that intelligence, what ministries they're sharing it with the Israelis. So there's that. There's also 60 massive cargo flights which have gone from various UK bases to Israel since October 7th, which we're not allowed to know what's on them.
Those direct flights, are they stopping at Akrotiri or?
No, well, so we don't know where they're coming from because, again, the government won't tell us. But I constructed a timeline from Akrotiri, and 36 of those were from Akrotiri. So, and Akrotiri, for viewers, is a huge, sprawling airbase on Cyprus that we retained after Cyprus got independence in 1960. Or did Cyprus get independence? Because Britain retained 3% of Cyprus's landmass. and they have this massive RAF base called Akrotiri in the west, and they have another huge base in the east called Declassified, which is all intelligence and surveillance facilities. And that has been central to the whole of the operation in Gaza in terms of getting international kit to Israel. In fact, Haaretz, the liberal newspaper in Israel, they said that it's the international hub for getting stuff to Israel. Again, we're not allowed to know what's going on there. So we've asked, and MPs have asked for information about things like, are the US Air Force sending weapons to Israel via Akrotiri, and they said we can't comment on allies' movements on our bases and stuff. And in fact, the interesting thing is we did a whole sort of stream of stories. This was amazing to me, actually, and it became a huge issue in Cyprus. President of Cyprus had to comment, President of Northern Cyprus had to comment, and then there were huge demonstrations in Limassol, the second city in Cyprus, which is next to RAF Akrotiri, and then one actually in RAF Akrotiri. And through the whole thing, even when presidents were talking about it, there wasn't one mention of it in the UK media. And it was all because of us. So it shows the power of what you're talking about, social media and the internet allowing the diffusion of information and journalism that would otherwise get completely out of the public realm. And then the other thing is the special forces, which again we know nothing about because we can't have. The special forces are maybe the most secret part of the British state. After MI5, MI6, G6Q, special forces are even more secret. And it was reported in The Sun on October 27th that the SAS had deployed to Cyprus, to the British bases on Cyprus, for Gaza hostage rescue operations. That's what they said, the leaker. The following day, a D-notice was sent out by the Ministry of Defence. Now, the D-notice committee, which a lot of people don't know about, is this committee which is run by the Ministry of Defence, but has sort of intelligence officials as well, and they meet every 6 months at the Ministry of Defence with this collection of journalists and basically discuss what they can and can't publish. And they sent out, and then that committee has these things called advisories that they send out to all editors. I don't know if you've ever got one at Joe.
They're not talking to us.
No, but they send out these advisories. They say, please don't publish anything about certain things, and they also say don't publish this D-notice. And usually they sent them out actually after the Edward Snowden leaks in 2013, and the Guardian didn't abide by them bravely and rightly. But anyway, they sent out this, and then they sent one. I think it was probably a mistake on their part. They sent one to the Socialist Worker newspaper, which is this tiny sort of weekly newspaper, and they publicised it. So we knew about the D-notice, but since that day, October 28th, not any information has been published about how many troops are in Israel, because I imagine some of those military transport flights from Akrotiri are taking soldiers, SAS soldiers and regular soldiers as well. And probably the SAS is in an advisory role about the ground operation, or were. They're probably not, knowing what I know about previous operations, they're probably not on the ground in Gaza, but they're in an advisory role. And you're talking about a country that is being investigated by the World Court and the ICC for war crimes and genocide. This is stuff we need to know. This is stuff that could get ministers prosecuted, for sure, and they should be. Because the other thing is that the UK government really, really doesn't want this information out, because I think they're aware that they could be liable. One of the funniest interactions between some MPs and the Ministry of Defence through parliamentary questions was this MP asked, well, as I mentioned, is the US Air Force using RAF Akrotiri to send weapons to Israel, which would make Britain liable, criminally liable? They said, we don't comment on allies' movements. So he said another question. He said, okay, fine. Don't tell me how many are landing and what's on it. Just tell me, are you aware when US Air Force flights land, what is on them? They said, well, we can't even tell you that. So they're scared to even say that they have any information about what's being done there, because they know it can be used against them. So it's extensive. And again, none of it has got into the mainstream media. I mean, another one, which story I broke was, the The UK military was refusing to say how many Israeli military flights had landed in the UK since the bombing of Gaza began. Then I independently constructed a timeline, and I found that they'd landed in 4 different locations. Subsequent to that, the government changed their policy and then admitted that 9 Israeli military flights had landed, 1 at Glasgow Prestwick Airport. And subsequent to that, the SNP rescinded the access that the Israeli Air Force has to Glasgow Prestwick. And then an MP asked the question set like later down the line, a couple of months later, to say, okay, what's the updated number? Because the 9 was a couple of months before. They said, oh no, we've changed policy again now, and there's a blackout. So like it's just been constantly changing. I think that they're just scared because it's out of control what's going on in Gaza. And the more that comes out about them being complicit materially, and it's material complicity, then they should be prosecuted. I don't think that would happen, but obviously we're in new territory because the ICC has never issued an arrest warrant or sought an arrest warrant against a Western leader, and they've now done it.
I think anyone with sort of a baseline of logic, try and walk onto an RAF base or an RAF runway, right? You're not getting anywhere near it. It's a military facility.
Yeah.
The idea that our Air Force, our military forces would not know what is coming in and out of the base, that they are very strict and control. Everyone who's there, they know who they are, they know where they are, they know what they're doing there.
Yes.
It's kind of, it stretches the limits of our belief that a transport plane would land and they wouldn't know who was flying it, why it was there, what was inside it. Not least just on like basic security
principles. By the way,
I'll
just add that it's important people know this. The same policy operates in the UK because we have over 12,000 US military personnel permanently based here. And there are 11 RAF sites, but they're not RAF sites.
Yes.
They're called RAF sites, but they're leased to the Americans and effectively American operated. And there's 2 big ones near London called Mildenhall and Lakenheath. Lakenheath, where they're talking about redeploying nuclear weapons there. But anyway, they operate as black sites for the Americans. You can't get any information about what the American. If you send a Freedom of Information Act request, or an MP asks a question about what the Americans are doing there, including are they using them to transport weapons, they say we don't comment on Allies movements in Britain. So that they have complete black sites within Britain. It's not known about. But that goes to an interesting part of Britain, which is actually in the book as well. Is about how controlled we are by the United States, because like that book, the book was mainly written about weak states in the developing world, like Haiti or Honduras, these places that traditionally have just been completely under control of the US. And you imagine that, okay, Britain's a bit different, you know. We're a sovereign country, but you realise, firstly, the military presence that I've talked about, the intelligence presence, the NSA. Edward Snowden's leaks revealed that the NSA, which is the Americans' main surveillance agency, the National Security Agency, it effectively runs GCHQ Bude. GCHQ is Britain's biggest intelligence agency, and they have a site in Cornwall called GCHQ Bude. His leaks showed that they pay for it and they effectively run it. So you have our actual intelligence facilities being run by the Americans. The interference in the political system, like through groups like British American Project, which was set up with US Embassy funding in the 80s to try and cultivate the left away from anti-imperialist positions. When you start scratching the surface, you realise that it's like we talked about Israel, but the American control of our political system is even greater. And it was really explicit in 2019 with Jeremy Corbyn. You know, Mike Pompeo, when he was Secretary of State, came here soon, about 6 months before the election. He was also the director of the CIA from 2017 to 18, and Pompeo came here in 2019. And he said, we will do this is a quote, our level best to stop Corbyn getting elected. And you just think, okay, that should be a major, major scandal. You have the foreign minister, Secretary of State of America coming and saying we're going to stop the leader of the Labour Party becoming Prime Minister. And we don't know what that meant and what they were doing in the background. But again, the mainstream media barely covered that. It was written up in the papers, but can you imagine if that had been Russia talking about any politician? It would
foreign
be
interference in a democratic process.
Of course, and it is. And the CIA are experts at that.
Yeah.
But we don't know what they do here. But it has been quite revelatory at Declassified, understanding how much Britain is controlled by it, because we've only ever had, since the Second World War, 2 Labour leaders which have not been Atlanticist. or hadn't not been signed up to the American imperial project, and that's Michael Foot, who was leader from 1980 to 83, and Jeremy Corbyn. And we know, because you're probably a bit younger than me, but we know about what happened with Corbyn. We weren't born when Michael Foot was around, but it was the same thing. And Michael Foot's 1983 manifesto, it's called the longest suicide note in history. It's worth reading because it's really radical. He says we want to withdraw from NATO, like stuff that you just you couldn't get near a manifesto now, a Labour manifesto, even under Corbyn. But he did say that, but he also said when Warsaw Pact is disbanded as well. It wasn't a unilateral thing. But British American project was set up explicitly to fight back against what Michael Foot did. And this whole thing of like, why is it that we've only had Michael Foot and Jeremy Corbyn? It's because we've had massive interference from the US state through intelligence agencies, through campaigns, through different groups that have been set up, and it continues. But again, it's completely secret. There's some good work done on the British American project by Paul Foot, but since then, not much. And I think that it's really got to change because the American empire, as I said, is the most powerful empire, and it's causing mayhem around the world and has been for since the Second World War.
No, that's all right. I kind of, to try and take some of these points back to sort of first principles, and whether it's, I'll use both the example of the special forces and possibly also our sort of discussions about our alliance with Israel, which is that your arguments about transparency and sort of journalistic rigor, investigation in relation to the special forces, for example, I think the argument will come back is like, well, if we're open and honest about what these organisations are doing, they're kind of redundant to us. The purpose of the special forces is to operate in secret, to do, I'm not advocating for but to do the things that we don't want people to know about, right?
Yes.
Similarly, if we talk about, our military intelligence, political support for the state of Israel, and we take that back to first principles, and whether that's sort of, Balfour Declaration all the way through to now, but essentially, we create the state of Israel in response to the Nazi horror, the 2,000 years of sort of pogroms and persecution that existed before. And we can say we are appalled by the way that Israel is prosecuting its latest war in Gaza. We can say that we're appalled by some of the things that Netanyahu and his cabinet say and do. But it's a slightly reductive argument, but we come back to first principles, which is essentially that if we want to adopt the position that the state of Israel should exist, we're kind of stuck supporting them in the way that we are.
Yeah, well, I don't think the state of Israel does have a right to exist in the way it does. I mean, I think that there should be a one-state solution, and they should incorporate, because I've been to Palestine twice, and effectively the West Bank is part of Israel. It's just it's run in an apartheid way. Yeah. They just have little cantons that to get like a mile can take like 4 hours because you have to go through these checkpoints. So there's
different cards if you're Israeli or if you're Palestinian.
Yeah, and let's be honest about how Israel's created. Yes, it is a British creation, right? The Balfour Declaration was 1917, so actually, and immigration was happening way before the Holocaust as well. So it wasn't explicitly a reaction to the Holocaust, although obviously that was used as a justification because of the horror that it was that they needed their own country, the Jewish people. But it was created in 1948 when 800,000 people were ethnically cleansed from Palestine, indigenous people, put in little bits of territory like Gaza, West Bank. And then after 1967, Israel kept on expanding. There could have been a two-state solution. The UN partition plan of 1947, if you look at it, it's like, I mean, the Arab world didn't accept it, because obviously they wouldn't. Who's going to accept just an imposition of a Western colony? But it's like half and half. And now, if you look at what Israel-Palestine is, it's just like this little strip in Gaza, which is basically destroyed. And then the West Bank is just chopped up into little, they call it Swiss cheese. That's what Israeli planners call it. So I don't think Israel has a right to exist if that's how it's going to operate. I think that Israel has a right to exist. I don't want to have a state. I don't believe a state should exist based on a one racial or ethnic group being supreme at all times. Because the other thing is 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinian, right? Mm-hmm. but they have to stay a minority. Otherwise, Israel will stop being a Jewish state, and that's the whole reason for it. So there's a lot of things that are offensive to progressive sensibilities that are mixed up with the fact that, of course, what you're talking about, the history of Jewish persecution and stuff. But the reality of it is it's a horror show. Like the West Bank it's worse. Like Desmond Tutu went there many years ago, and it was not even as bad as it is now. And he said it's worse than what we had in apartheid South Africa. So I think that what should happen is that they should allow all the refugees to go home. We don't want anyone to die. We don't want anyone to be killed. All the war criminals should.
Seems such an obvious thing to say out loud. Do you know what I mean?
But there has to be a way to allow some restitution and rectification of the massive crimes that have happened, because
this is the problem for me, right? Because before this latest round of, to use the Israeli parlance, mowing the lawn, right?
Yeah.
I would have, if you just said to me, how do you think this is resolved? I would say one state solution, right? In the style of sort of Chomsky, Pape, those guys who know a lot more about this than I do. And then this horror happens. And I don't know if it's even feasible at this point to suggest, right, that any kind of reconciliation between those two societies is possible. Because if you look at the discourse in Israel, what happened on October 7th has radicalized more, even more so than a lot of them already were. And there's a broader conversation about sort of demographic changes and the politics of the radical right in Israel, which I don't think we probably have time for today. But nonetheless, they're sort of hardened, right, in their feeling towards the Palestinians. Equally understandably, the more than 100,000 people that have been killed and maimed in Gaza now, you do not have to be a genius in radicalization to understand what the consequences of that are going to be for the future generations of Palestinians that come up, right? They are going to want to violently resist the Israelis.
Yeah.
Understanding, or at least in my sense, understanding that, there is no peace without justice, right? There has to be, whether it's the prosecution of people who have committed war crimes, and it was interesting actually when you were talking there kind of about, apartheid in the West Bank, looking at Northern Ireland as an example of gerrymandering, what happens if you try to enshrine a kind of, religious in that case, majority, it can change, as it is changing now.
Yeah.
And the consequences of it. It almost just seems completely impractical to me to suggest that we can live in a society, that the Israelis and the Palestinians can live in a society side by side at this point. I don't know how feasible it is.
But it might not be, but the two-state solution is also not feasible. And the Israelis have never really believed in it. Because if you look at, and that's not just Netanyahu, because they now try and pin the blame on him. In the 90s, he had this thing called the Alon Plus plan, which was basically just that the Israelis would take 60% of the West Bank, all of Area A, and have like 4 non-contiguous cantons, and then Ehud Barak, who was the Labour Prime Minister, he oversaw the biggest extension of settlements in the whole period, and that's Labour. So it's a bipartisan desire to take the West Bank, because in sort of it's Eretz Israel, it's Greater Israel. That's what they want. They left Gaza because Gaza's kind of a backwater. There wasn't much that they wanted there. But they've never shown since 1967 any desire to withdraw from West Bank along the 1967 lines, the Green Line, and establish a Palestinian state. The Israelis have been an obstacle to that for decades and decades, and they're not going to allow it. So that's also not possible. So that's what needs to happen, in my opinion. The only way there's ever going to be any kind of justice or peace there is if the West conditions its support on Israel acting like a normal country and acting in a peaceful way. I mean, if you look recently about the Yemen conflict with Saudi Arabia, that's been going on, basically inflamed by the US and the UK, and the UK, again, that's a whole nother conversation, has been materially involved in that, and BAE Systems. But the Chinese came in, and within a couple of weeks, there was peace. The propaganda system presents the US as the neutral arbiter and the promoter of peace in Palestine and Israel, Palestine, and but they're not. They're on the side of the Israelis, and that's the problem. We need a neutral arbiter, someone who says to Israel, no, you have to abide by international law. I mean, for me, I just find Zionism a strange concept. If I said to you, you're just going to impose a country on a country that already exists, kick out most of the indigenous people, and then make it so anyone who is Jewish can go and live there, I don't even know if I qualify, but my dad's Jewish. I don't know if that means I could qualify. Maybe it does. I've got no connection to it. Yet you have millions of refugees that can't go back to their country. How does that make sense? It's a very, very bizarre concept. And I think the problem many people have is we do know the history of anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews. So people want to believe that the propaganda, which is that this is a safe haven for Jews, blah, 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 but it's not. Israel makes life much more dangerous for the Jews around the world than anything else, because it's just promoting, because the propaganda is that all Jews are Zionists and anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And when you conflate those two, and constantly conflate those two, it puts Jews at risk, because it makes any crime committed by the Israelis the fault of Jews around the world, which of course it's not, and it shouldn't be seen like that. But the Israeli state, that's one of their major propaganda organs and all their lobby groups around the world. They constantly, anyone who's pro-Palestinian or speaking out about Israeli human rights violations is an anti-Semite. But you can only believe that if you believe that all Jews are Zionists or all Jews are Israeli war criminals, which obviously is not the case. So I think that this has exposed this issue on a level that it's never been exposed, that I've never seen people understanding the history of this. Because we did a video the other day with a group called Palestine Deep Dive, a 5-minute video on the history of Zionism. It got like 1.5 million views on Instagram in 2 days. And that is, people have a thirst for knowledge now, because as you say, they're looking at their screens, they're getting a completely warped view when they look at, they're looking at their phones and seeing all this horror, and they're getting a warped view when they look at their TV, and they're saying, well, there's a disconnect there. They're thirsty for the real information. So we need to provide that to them, because the other rabbit hole people can go down in that situation when they're not getting good information is conspiracy theories and stuff like that. So I think that alternative media like you guys, us guys, is important. And I
wonder if you think that's a barrier to the kind of serious, detailed, truthful discussion about what's happening there, because there are bad faith actors, right, who seek to weaponize anti-Semitism and seek actually to kind of turn the very serious and sincere concern about what's happening there channel it into a more conspiratorial, anti-Semitic, dangerous politics, right?
Yeah.
And it's almost, in a way, a product of, if you do have a political blackout, if you do have, broadly speaking, certainly in establishment media, a blackout of a diversity of opinion on this, you almost create a vacuum, right?
Yes, exactly. Good example. Look, my boss, co-founder as well of Declassified, Mark Curtis, right? Yeah. He's a brilliant guy. I think like the best popular historian in the country. He single-handedly rewrote the history of British foreign policy post-1945. He's the smartest on this topic of anyone I've ever met. He's never invited on the BBC or anywhere. He knows way more than anyone you see on there talking about these issues, and yet he's never invited on him. So people are just starved of having any critical analysis of what is going on. And it's very interesting, actually. One of the major things you see in the propaganda system here, and it's also in the US, it's less so in the US because they don't have the history of the British Empire, but the British Empire here, so you're allowed to go on the media here, on the BBC, and talk about the crimes of the British Empire in the past. Fine. In fact, it's even promoted. And it makes liberals feel good because we're not there. If you start talking about imperial crimes now, the six special forces wars, covert wars that have happened over the last 10 years, so no way, you can't, or it's impossible to talk about. And that's quite interesting, isn't it? That you're allowed to talk about historical crimes, but not the ones going on now. And I think that's a way that it protects power, because it projects the image that all that's in the past, and also it defends the current criminals because their crimes aren't being exposed. But yeah, I think your point is right. It does leave a massive vacuum, and it's dangerous because, like, we're at a very, very, very dangerous point in the world, and people are confused and scared, and the far right is the one, or the far left, or the extremes are going to be the ones that people go to, and the far left's nowhere in terms of organisation, in terms of institutional forms, And the far right is very organised and has a much simpler message because they can just blame it on immigrants or whoever they want to blame it on. And yeah, I mean, we need to step up really. I mean, like if you look what happened under Jeremy Corbyn from 2015, there was so much hope that there could be change. And it seems that they've smashed it to pieces, but I think that we need to kind of regroup it all. I mean, personally, my take is the independence movement is super, super exciting because even if they don't win, and I'm not saying they won't win, but they're up against it, right? But then you'll have a cohort of really, really inspiring people that can do something afterwards. Because what's going to happen is Keir Starmer's going to get a landslide. And then very quickly after, I think it's going to get quite interesting because people are going to be like, well, I've been sold this lie, effectively, that everything's going to be all right if we get the Tories out for many, many years. And then they're going to be, actually, okay, not much is changing. And then they're going to be like, okay, well, then at that point, something interesting is going to happen, whether it's on the far right or far left or just rioting or whatever it is. We need to be ready organisationally to take advantage of the fact that people, and when I say take advantage, I don't mean actually like for ourselves, I mean take advantage politically of the fact that people are have an awareness of the fact that the two main parties are not there to represent them, they're there to represent the same interests effectively. And I think the independence movement could do it. Liane Mohammed, who is a British Palestinian woman she's only 23, and she's standing in Ilford North, which is where Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, seat. And I went to interview her the other day. Just incredible woman, like super, super politically aware, speaks very eloquently about the issues. And I was just thinking, there's a lot of people like that around that we just don't know about. And they'll rise to the surface, hopefully. And the independence movement is promoting some of them. There's Andrew Feinstein. He's not as young as Liane, but he's a friend of mine. He's a super, super powerful person. He was an aide to Nelson Mandela, an ANC MP. He's also written the most important book on the arms trade ever written. He's an investigative journalist. He's great, and he's standing against Keir Starmer in Holborn. So I don't think if these people, I'm not saying they will lose, but I don't think if these people lose, they just go away. I think that there's going to be a need, and people want to rally around people when the nightmare that I think is going to happen with Labour starts.
I agree with that sort of analysis of what that next Parliament and sort of the term and cycle afterwards entails, and I think it has the potential to be an inflection point. I mean, like so many other political moments in recent British history, it also has the potential to disappoint, so I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself.
Yeah.
There's these independents, right? Some sort of purged from the Labour Party, Corbyn, Faiza Shaheen. There's other nascent, well, I don't know how nascent George Galloway is, but certainly the Workers' Party is sort of looking like it's going to possibly turn up in a greater way than it has done so far with just him winning by-elections. And I'm struck actually by a word you used talking about Liane Mohammed, eloquent. Because Galloway can talk, you know, he's an orator. But there are some things that he says, I cannot describe them as eloquent, right? You know, recent examples, he gave that interview to Navarro, didn't he, where he was talking about whether or not it's normal to, whether or not a child growing up with two mums or two dads is normal versus a mum and a dad was, you know, going backwards and forwards about gay rights with Aaron. Some of their candidates talking about having sort of friendly relations with Russia. And I wonder your analysis of whether you view the Workers' Party being part of that sort of interesting, something that you would possibly support, independent political movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's exciting. I think that we have a system where we're made to hate people by a system that's operated by people that we really should hate. If that makes sense. I know that's a bad way of saying it, but what I'm saying is like Galloway. Like Galloway, okay, I don't agree with everything he says, definitely, but he hasn't ever killed anyone. Look at Alistair Campbell. This is a guy that we're meant to celebrate, and yet he is on record as cooking intelligence to lie us into a war in Iraq, which killed 1 million people and destroyed a society of 30 million people. And no one has any problem with getting him on TV or talking about him being affiliated to the Labour Party. Why should I hate George Galloway? Why should I hate George Galloway? Why should I hate the Workers' Party? I think the Workers' Party has different elements to it. I'm not going to agree with all of them. But there's a whole industry set up to destroy those people and make us hate them. I think that like we need to be open-minded and not get into this whole battle, because effectively they can destroy anyone, you know. Like, look at what happened during the anti-Semitism crisis under Corbyn. People said some stupid stuff, but also everything was weaponized. So if you don't stand up against that and you start joining in and let them break you off from each other, then they can pick you off. And that's exactly what they've done in Labour, by the way. Look, if you look, because everyone talks now, and this is even part of the left, if I'm going to be honest, like about, okay, well now we understand what Starmer's really about. It's like, guys, 2 months into him being elected leader, he'd sacked Rebecca Long-Bailey as a shadow minister for tweeting an article which was an interview of Maxine Peake in Independent, which is maybe the most mad thing he's done the whole time. And that's like super brass eye stuff, you know? Yeah. It's like, and so he signaled it straight away, and he picked them off one by one, and then Corbyn was suspended, and, you know, like, and...
Isn't this kind of an argument, though, for actually, if you want to sort of achieve political change, and you want that political movement to be successful, it's almost an argument for, I don't want to say removing those people from your movement, but if, for example, you know that your political opponents are going to seek to weaponize very minor transgressions against you, your candidates, your party, at that point, it might not be necessarily a moral choice, but a tactical choice. Say, we can't tolerate opinions like that. And I appreciate that's quite an anti-democratic position to take. But if you're pragmatic about power, maybe it's one that you have to adopt.
Well, it was what the Corbyn administration adopted. If you look at what happened to Chris Williamson, for example, he was suspended for saying we should stop apologising for our record on anti-Semitism, right? Which was presented as him saying anti-Semitism is fine or whatever. What he was saying is we should stop playing into the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And he was suspended. And then they found all sorts of things across the board that, yes, if it's presented in a certain way, you know, like Corbyn wrote a forward to Hobson's
imperialism.
Yeah, and they use that. They'll always find something. There's always something if it's going to be weaponized. And then the real anti-Semitism, if they're politically made people like some like Rachel Reeves or someone, it doesn't get in the papers because it's not about anti-Semitism. This is the really important thing. It's not about anti-Semitism. In fact, it makes anti-Semitism much, much harder to fight because if you tar everyone with it and you weaponize it and use it to destroy opponents of Israel or opponents of Labour or the Tories, then it makes people switch off. And we don't want people to switch off when they hear that someone's an anti-Semite. We want them to be outraged. So I don't think I understand what you're saying. Like in terms of tactics, you should get rid of people that are vulnerable to this kind of attack. But it won't work because they'll always find something, and because it's not real. It's the Hobson thing, for example, was in all the major papers. It was complete invention. It was nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So I think what needs to happen more is just to call it out. There is a whole infrastructure in this country which is set up to destroy anyone who speaks out with a pro-Palestinian voice. That's the reality, and and you've seen it, like the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which presents itself as a voice of British Jews, but actually is lobbying on Israel's behalf, and that's not a conspiracy theory. If you look into meetings that they have with the government, they're going in to talk about Israel, and they've people within them have said we lobby for Israel. So they have an interest in presenting anyone who is against Israel as an anti-Semite, and that's the weaponization of anti-Semitism is awful, and a betrayal of the noble fight against anti-Semitism. So my take is more we should tactically remove people from the movement that might be vulnerable to it, but more fight back against the people who are smearing it and present them as the promoters of anti-Semitism, which they are, because they make the real stuff much harder to fight.
Matt Kennard, thank you so much for taking the time to come in. Really good to talk to you again. The Racket, available from all good bookstores.
All good bookstores and bad ones.
Matt, thank you.
Take care.